I'll just remember it whenever it's he actually is kind of he's in his role playing. I said, just be you. Just be on.
Oh, wait.
Some of your own front row.
We'll have you. I'll try to put on you. I am going to tell them. I'll know you're going to be in here for about 5 minutes. You start with
One shot.
pretty good.
Legs taken.
Were you sitting here before I came over?
Evidently doesn't matter. Evidently doesn't matter. All right. I'm not saying, I'm just saying.
Hey, Abby.
It's a back of the
You
bus,
sit in the
Abby.
front row.
Good to see you. Glad we get together with one another here on this Wednesday night. Before we jump into our discussion, go ahead and see if there's any specific prayer requests. Here's the member over there. Anybody got anything you need to pray about?
The little girl that was found, Camille McKenny.
All right. What else? Everybody's good?
Show up anytime.
Great. Hey,
Something never changed.
that's true. That's true. Okay. If we don't have any other prayer requests, we'll go ahead and pray, and then we'll get started. Lord and Almighty God, we're grateful that we have the privilege to call you our God, Father. And we're grateful that we have the opportunity to know you, to study your word. Father, we are an incredibly privileged people in so many ways, Father, to live at this time and this place, to have a community of believers that we can gather together with, Father, and lean upon, encourage one another, and just be together and share our love for you and your Son, Jesus. As we get ready to enter into this time of study and discussion, we just pray that you would be with us, help us to encourage one another, stir each other up to love and good works. Father, we do want to pray for the little girl and the family, Miss Camille McKinney. Just pray for that situation. Father, there are many others in our care lines, Father, that we're mindful of with various health issues and other things that are going on. Just pray that you'd be with each one of those situations as well. We ask all these things in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. All right, so like we do so many nights, we're going to start out reading the text. If y'all recall, or for those who might not be here on Sunday, Chuck, the text was Matthew 1:1-17, which I'm sure when people are asked what their favorite section of Scripture is, you always hear Matthew 1:1-17. It's very popular. Okay, that kind of fell flat, didn't it? All right, anyway, so this is the genealogy that Matthew has to start off his gospel. That's what Chuck talked about on Sunday, and that's what we're going to discuss tonight. I'm going to read the whole thing. As we're going through, I want you to do two things. One is I want you to listen to the names and try to tick off how many that you recognize. Not because Chuck read them on Sunday, but you actually remember reading something about them at some point or hearing something about them and who they were. So think about that, and then to the extent you do know someone, think about kind of why you know who they are and how they fit into the story. Because we're going to talk some more about that in a few minutes, because I just think it's just really cool. It's just really cool. Okay. All right, so Matthew 1, starting in verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse. I think we had an over-under in by one. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mattan, and Mattan the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, to whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Okay, so, does everybody Think about how many names they knew. Everybody keep count. So obviously we've got some kind of big ones at the beginning. We've got Abraham, he's probably pretty familiar. We've got Isaac, we got Jacob. Those are kind of three that I think most people probably know. Then you get into Judah. Then, you have some that maybe aren't as well known. Then you get down to Rahab. Most people kind of remember her. Ruth and Boaz. A lot of people remember. Then you have Jesse and David. Then after David, you have Solomon. And then you get into this time period with the kind of divided kingdom, and you have all these kings, and they get all confusing because a lot of them have the same. You got Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and I don't remember which one was which. Then you get down, you might remember a couple, maybe Hezekiah, Josiah maybe, some of the good kings. Then you get to the deportation of Babylon, and you kind of don't know who anybody is. Is there anything from Chuck's sermon or from this reading that you think is interesting, or that you thought was particularly meaningful?
What was the significance of 14, 14, and 14?
No, you don't ask the question.
Observation. There's obviously something important.
Well,
I've heard it said that means Jesus is the seventh seven. And 7 is the number of completion and perfection. And so Jesus is that perfect seventh. He's bringing the Jubilee. And that last group of 14 is actually talking about the exile. And Jesus has come to take us all out of exile. So the idea that he is freeing the slaves, which is what the Jubilee was about, it all kind of ties together.
there's a lot of things to tie in with this. I do think it has something to do with the number 7. It's a pretty important number in biblical scholarship, and you see number 7 a lot, and it does represent perfection. I had heard about what Jennifer said about how it relates to Jubilee in some way, but I haven't studied that specifically. There might be somebody in here that might know more about it, but I don't know.
Johnny, I think this is not all the generations. So, he skipped some. You compare it to Luke's version, but anyway, you look at the Old Testament for that matter, and you'll see that Matthew skipped some. And so another possibility is that Matthew arranged it like that in sets of 14 as a mnemonic device, because they were big on genealogies and for them to be able to remember it in 3 segments that's equal in number. So it's a possibility as well.
Any other kind of questions or observations?
Who kept these records?
That's a good question.
Priest.
Well, particularly, sorry.
I think the priest did.
Yeah, I was going to say, particularly that's a good question in light of the exile. Obviously, post-exile, that would have been, or at least during the time of the exile, that would have been very difficult. But we do.
The courthouse didn't burn at least once during all this.
Well, I think it basically did when they burned the temple. But yeah, I think the priests would have, or the Levites would have had that role. But we do know, I'm sure, at least at some degree, it was kept within family units. I think we all know Jewish people were big on their lineage because they had to tie it back to Abraham, and so they probably knew their own and were able to go back on that. I want to say, we know that Joseph went back to Bethlehem because he's of the line of David, so he at least knew his personal one all the way back to David, which would have been several generations. So I think family units themselves kept a lot of it. I don't know if, I just don't know if they had just more generalized census records, like we would keep today. All right, anybody else? Okay. Before we move on, why is Ruth in the Old Testament? Why is the book of Ruth in the Old Testament?
Well, she was in Jesus' lineage, and she was not a Jew. So I think it was to show the future of welcoming Gentiles into the church.
The person that wrote down the story of Ruth, do you think that's what they were thinking?
No.
So Ruth lived, as you can see in this genealogy, absent, skipping and potential leaving some out. Ruth is not too far removed from David, but is older than David in terms of the lineage. She lived about, give or take, 1,200 years before Jesus was born. The story of Ruth is a great story, but in terms of giving you an idea of what's going on with the Jewish people and the Israelites at this time, it doesn't add a whole lot. It's very kind of personal to her, Boaz, Naomi, what's going on with that particular family. I think Ruth is because she's in the lineage. What makes it so, the person who wrote Ruth down, came into the world, didn't know that in the Old Testament. So, Ruth is included in the Torah, in their Bible. To me, it lends a lot of credence and evidence to the story that's told in the Bible to say that you have a story like Ruth, and there are several of these kind of stories that are in there, and it all ties into the story that is being told from Genesis, all the way back, starting with Genesis 3, where you have the first of Jesus, and then more specifically in Matthew chapter 1, in terms of the genealogy, and then later the birth narrative. It's all coming to a head there, and everything that's in there points to that. Everything that's in there points to that event. Everything that you're reading about with what's going on with the Israelites from the time in Egypt to the time of the kings and all the prophets relate to this. Another thing that I thought about was, you have the divided kingdom. The northern kingdom goes away. The southern kingdom remains for a couple more hundred years, and they still have their kings that are still descended from the line of David. Eventually they go away, and the line isn't broken. So a lot of times when you have, in the ancient world, when you have civilization, an empire come and destroy another civilization, what do they do to the king? They kill him, and they kill the family, because you can't have rival kings, because all you're going to do is incite revolt, because the locals are going to say, well, he's our real king, we're going to put him back on the throne and try to overthrow our oppressors. You can still trace the line from David and Solomon despite the exile, which is pretty amazing, because that just usually didn't happen. So anyway, that's another thing that I was thinking about, is that line wasn't destroyed like so often that would have been. Anybody got anything else before we move on? Okay. All right, we're going to talk real quick. Let's talk about Abraham and David. Just very briefly, why is Jesus called the son of Abraham? Anybody? There's a softball. Come on.
The promise that God made to Abraham.
Which promise?
Through you, all nations.
Right.
That's part of the promise.
That's right. I guess he made multiple promises to Abraham.
Yeah.
All right, so, yes, so Chuck talked about this on Sunday. You go to Genesis 12, and it's in Genesis 12, 1 through 7. God makes a couple different promises to Abraham, but one of those is found in verse 3. And he says, this is when God tells Abram to leave his land and go to a new land, that he's going to make him a great nation. And then you go to verse 3. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So, as I was just talking about, the story, the whole thing is about Jesus, right? The story of Jesus and the line that he is going to come to the world starts there, about 1,500 years before he comes into the world. Okay? That's approximately when Abraham lived. That's, from our perspective, that's a long time. That's a long time. And we're 2,000 years removed from Christ, so that's 3,500 years of human time that was covered. And it's the way it fits together after that and all the things that happen is so awesome. Then you go to why is he called the son of David? All right, this is another one. You got this. Will Sperlin, why is he called the son of David?
Lineage.
Huh?
In the lineage.
He is in the lineage. Anybody else?
God made David a promise that his line would never end.
Thank you. 2 Samuel 7, he makes a specific promise to David that he was going to place his son on the throne, and that throne, or that he would have him sit on that throne forever. Now, the last king that ruled, that you read about in the genealogy that Matthew puts, before the exile, like I said, he was a descendant of David. After that, there wasn't a king that sat on David's throne from the time of the exile until the time of Christ. Now, you did have the Herods and stuff, but that's different. So, it could appear that that promise was not fulfilled. However, we know that during that whole time, Jesus was sitting on his throne in heaven, and then he comes to earth and establishes that forever kingdom. Okay. Chuck spent some time on Sunday talking about the women that are mentioned in this genealogy. The women are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and then Mary. Chuck made the point during the sermon that in just about all of these situations, there was something, what word would you use, scandalous, or in some of these cases, something very bad happened. But most of them, most of these stories have some aspect to them that is not your normal, husband, wife, 2 kids, and a dog type thing. Remember Tamar, she in particular had a really bad family situation with Judah was her father-in-law. Her first husband died, her second husband died. She was waiting for her third husband, the next son in line. And Judah, I can't remember if he intentionally did it or he at least forgot about her, I think. And so, if you think about it from her perspective in the ancient world, she didn't have anybody to take care of her. And so how normally that would happen is if your husband dies, you need to have a son who you can raise up to basically take care of you. And so she needed to have a son, and so she dresses up like a prostitute and seduces Judah so that she can have a son. She ends up having twins. But that's one of those twins is in the line. You have Rahab, who saved the spies, and then she was an innkeeper, most likely a prostitute. She ends up being saved when the Israelites take the city. She and her family are saved. They come to live with the Israelites. She then ends up getting married to an Israelite and have children that ends up in the line. You've got Ruth, which we've already said. People are probably like, well, there's nothing really scandalous about Ruth. There's something to point out is one of the things she did with regards to Boaz is she went and fell at his feet. I can't remember the details of it right now, but anyway, she was that was at least not something that was typically done. And of course, she was not Jewish. She was a Moabite. So for Boaz to take her as a wife would have probably been looked down upon because under the old law, they weren't supposed to marry Moabites or any of the other Canaanite women. Then you have Bathsheba. I think everybody knows that story. And then you have Mary. And of course, again, as Chuck mentioned on Sunday, as we know sitting here today, Mary, there's nothing scandalous about Mary. But as Chuck pointed out, I'm quite certain the talk of the village was quite scandalous. And more, I think it. I would not be. I mean, it's funny enough. We were reading this week. I don't know who's been able to keep up with the reading or not, but this week we're in the Gospels, and one of the readings was, and I can't remember which Gospel it was in, but he was having a discussion with the Pharisees. Jesus was having a discussion with the Pharisees, and they said something about his birth, and him being illegitimate. And so clearly that story was out, and it was continuing to follow him. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, given what we had talked about on Sunday. Does anybody have any comments they want to make about the women and their inclusion in the genealogy?
I think it's interesting that they don't really mention Bathsheba by name. They say the wife of Uriah. So Uriah's mentioned, not really Bathsheba.
Yeah, I agree. I do find it interesting. It's also interesting that in so many of these cases, you go back to how often God defies what our human expectations are. So our human expectations would be for Esau to be the one that the birthright goes through, not Jacob. Our human expectations would not have been for David to be king, but one of his brothers who was bigger and stronger and older. So there just so many times God defies our expectations. With the fact that he chose the child of Bathsheba to be the next king is also an interesting one. David had other children. Now Absalom, we kind of know what happened with him, but the fact that Solomon was chosen to be, I think, is an interesting twist, but that again kind of defies our expectations. He takes something that was bad and then turns it into something that ends up being good. So anyway, that's a good observation. Somebody else had one, I think.
In our Tuesday morning ladies class, we've been studying the book of Nehemiah, and we've gone through the life of Jesus and whatnot. And I find it interesting that most of the women that Jesus had encounters with could almost be matched parallel to the women in his lineage. The woman at the well, Tamar, the Rahab, the prostitute, the woman caught in adultery, the unclean woman, all of them, the women that they named or told stories about are very similar to the women that were in his lineage.
Never thought of that.
I heard a biblical scholar a number of years ago, and I don't remember all the details, but he was talking about the fact that, and what you referenced, that it was a known fact that, I guess from a Jewish perspective, Jesus would have been born, or at least you can see, out of wedlock. And that in Jewish society at the time, there would have been certain privileges. He wouldn't have had nothing extensive, but there would have been certain things he wouldn't have had access to that somebody that was, not born in wedlock would have had. That there would have been certain, I guess, difficulties he would have had in society.
I think that's, yeah, I'm sure I'm quite certain that's the case. It certainly would not have been looked favorably upon. Okay. Hopefully, based on what Chuck talked about, reading the genealogy, thinking about what has been discussed tonight, you can see the continuity starts all the way back in Genesis and moves all the way through the Old Testament until you get to the Gospels. And I think that is designed very specifically to strengthen our faith. I hope it does. Does anybody have any comments about how that is in fact the case? That seeing this kind of story unfold is a strength-building thing?
I think seeing how God works things out through tragedy, through stupid decisions, through the most negative situations, the worst of the worst, and how whatever his plan is, he doesn't let anything get in the way of that. It ends up, like you said, using the most, inappropriate, or unconventional people and ways to do that, so that when we mess up or when we are doubtful in any way or we're having issues, struggling with controlling our situations, I just think it gives us a picture, a better, more clear picture of, the fact that God does have a plan. And, no matter what happens, it's his plan and he's going to make it work out.
I think it really, I kind of mentioned this when I was making that comment about the book of Ruth, or the story of Ruth. If you think about it again, the Old Testament covers a very, very long time period. Matthew wrote down the genealogy somewhere in the vicinity of 80, 60. Okay. All of the books that he was referencing, that he quotes from, prophecies, etc., were all written down about 400 years before that, or thereabouts. The activities that are being described certainly occurred more than 400 years before that, because you have that long intertestamental period of about 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, or birth of Jesus. So, just the way that the Old Testament, from the stories we read about, you have all the prophecies, and just why certain things are included and mentioned and other things aren't. I think Chuck maybe have mentioned this, or if you think about it, why would anybody put the story of Tamar in the Bible? Like, why would you include something that terrible in there? Because it appears at the time it's only bad. Like, why would you want to put that in there? Well, it appears obvious to us now because we have Matthew 1. But the person who was living in, 50 BC, why would they think that would be in there? Again, I think it just really adds to, and it just clarifies why the Old Testament says what it says, because it all leads, and it's all part of this one continuous story that leads to Christ. It's just, it's like putting together a puzzle that you can't see the picture that's reflected in the puzzle until you put the last piece in. And then the picture comes alive, but before that, it looked like it looked like one of those. Do y'all remember this is several years ago where they had the 3D art that you couldn't see unless you like crossed your eyes or whatever? Well, I never could see it even when I crossed my eyes, but somebody told me that there was a picture in there. And I remember there would be puzzles of those things, but you couldn't see it until you kind of did the whole puzzle. And so I kind of think of it like that. Something that Leah had mentioned a second ago was the fact that so many of these people that are referenced in the genealogy and then elsewhere that are important to what goes on with the children of Israel over the years, they're portrayed with their weaknesses as well as their strengths. Just about everybody that you read about, from the patriarchs all the way down, Abraham, Moses, he's not a lineage, but Moses, David, Solomon, and then on down the line, a lot of them had really great strengths. And David, man after God's own heart, but so many of them had really, I will say bad weaknesses. They had weaknesses. They were human just like me, and so does the fact that Jesus comes out of those, or comes out of people like that, does that in any way impact, your thoughts on how we can relate to Christ or how he relates to us? Yes.
I think you look at this lineage, and you say there's good and bad, and that's something we can relate to. That it's no different than us.
It might help us just understand Christ better. I think about some of my, I don't know, think about your favorite movie or your favorite book, and when they come out with a prequel where they give you more about a character and like their connections with other people and their family, it's always something you're like, yeah, that makes so much sense, and that's why that person maybe is like that, because I don't know, I think about it a little bit that way from the narrative point. And just it kind of develops him, as a character, and somebody with some humanity, of course, and you see that.
Well, and think about who Jesus primarily ministered to.
People like his family.
Or just people in his past.
Ancestry is really big now. It's like the big thing. And it's fascinating to go back and find people in your history. And they have all the TV shows about it, and you see the TV shows where they're shocked that there's someone in their history that was like a criminal, a slave owner, or just this terrible person. But it makes us who we are. And I think in a way, I don't know, Jesus had his humanness to him. He recognized that for not trying to deny the divinity. It's a soft spot for those kind of broken people.
I think Jesus would say, so who he has in his line, he has kings, he has, these big names. What that should, we're all broken people. And he can certainly relate based on that. He then comes and is serving broken people. He's talking about sinners coming to him. He's having the dinner with the Pharisee, and a woman comes, anoints him and then anoints his feet. And, the Pharisee, puts her down, and Jesus, tells him that this is, who I'm here to serve. He's eating with sinners. Jesus recognized that that's what people are like. It's the people that were living at the time didn't recognize that that's what people are like. People are all, in that regard, the same. They're all the same. That's why you don't read about anybody in the Old Testament that didn't have one of these flaws, because everybody has them. Go ahead, Paul.
Goes back to your comment earlier about God using these things that we would not expect. The people in the first century there that were expecting a Messiah probably would not have picked this lineage. It was like, no, that couldn't possibly work, because they would have had in mind something different. Like you said, God uses things sometimes that we would have not chose that, or we would have been baffled by, well, okay, why is that there?
I think they expected nothing like God constantly does. He doesn't go with our expectations. He actually defies them. There's no question that they expected every aspect of Jesus to be different. Basically, can anything good come from Nazareth? That line. And then, they expected swords and white horses and that whole kind of, they kept asking him for a sign. Well, what sign do you need? I've done signs.
Like you said, the illegitimate probably ranked up there somewhere pretty high.
Yeah, they certainly wouldn't have expected that. Okay. There are 3 questions here at the end that we're almost out of time, but something to be kind of thinking about as we leave and what we need to do. It says, when we leave here tonight, how can we be more consciously aware that Jesus responds to our brokenness with compassion and forgiveness? And the next one is, if we go about our daily lives, what can we do to share the hope of Jesus with people who've made a mess of their lives? What can we do to share the hope of Jesus with people who've made a mess of their lives?
Again, just remembering we've made a mess of our lives.
Thank
Right,
you.
there are those people who've made a mess of, and I've been reading a New Testament scholar lately who talks about this dual nature of Israel, and the way he expresses it, he talks about them as the people who are bearers of the solution, but also the carriers of the problem, right? And that they in some ways couldn't see Jesus because they thought they were just the bearers of the solution, right? They kind of forgot that they were at the exact same moment the problem. And we all have that same duality too, right? So we just have to keep that in mind. We live in that state.
That's exactly kind of what I was thinking is, how do you relate to somebody else? You have to acknowledge that, it said that you're, in a Christian sense, you're in the same state. Now, there are states of, saved and lost, but in terms of you're, in the Jewish sense of keeping the law perfectly, we're not there, and neither is anybody else you're going to talk to. But that aspect of humility, and you look at the example of Jesus and who he was ministering to, how did Jesus reach out to these people?
Well, and just impressing, upon them that that's what God does, is redeem. And, he doesn't wash over or forget, he didn't set out this very perfect line, because people who are overwhelmed by the sins that they've created or have been involved in or been, done to them, they can't look at someone who's had a seemingly typical life and think that, you see what I'm saying? They can't look at someone who's had a regular life and connect to them. But when they see the genealogy of Jesus and they see all of these things that have happened to people, in his genealogy, you can then connect and say, he's in the redeeming business. And, this is, if he has done this, if he has brought his son through this line of tragedy and sin, he can bring me as well.
And it's all over the New Testament, but the fact, Jesus knew about his history because he witnessed it, because he was there. But he knew that people are going to do what people do. As he tells them, he didn't come to help those who weren't sick. He came to help those that were sick. And you look through the line and you see people that mess up, and God never stopped it and said, well, I made a mistake. You people are really bad. I need to find somebody else. I think because God knew that if he started a new one, it probably would have turned out the same, because people are people. So, anybody got any closing comments? Right. All right. Well, everybody have a good rest of the week.
It wasn't
I'm tired, but I really do.
Cameron's going to actually, he ran.